Okay, so let's do a quick respiratory anatomy overview. It's really straightforward. Respiratory system consists of two zones, conducting zone and the respiratory zone. Okay? So conducting zone is charged with the delivery of oxygen to the lungs and basically mechanical movement of air. Conducting zone is comprised of the nasal cavity. So air gets into the nasal cavity. A few things about nasal cavity, listen up. So hair in the nasal cavity traps the dust and large particles. Mucus traps pathogens and smaller particles, right? And your nasal cavity contains folds that we call nasal conchae, superior, middle, and inferior. Does that make sense? Folds. When you have folds, what does that mean? What is the purpose of the folding? Exactly, increased surface area. This increased surface area helps to warm up and humidify the inhaled air, and also helps to trap humidity, trap vapors when you exhale through the nose to conserve some water. So from nasal cavity, air enters nasopharynx. Now remember that, so these two parts of the conducting zone are covered with a pseudostratified columnar epithelium, because these two parts of the respiratory system, of the conducting zone of the respiratory system, participate exclusively in respiration. From nasopharynx, air enters into the oropharynx, and then into laryngopharynx, and then into larynx. So these three parts, well, for our intents and purposes, I'll specify what happens in the larynx, but they are covered with a stratified squamous epithelium. The reason for it is that oropharynx, laryngopharynx, and technically a part of larynx can get in contact with food. Does that make sense? So strictly speaking, now what separates respiratory system from digestive system? Because remember, look, food, when it passes oropharynx and laryngopharynx, it then has two options. Either, well, food should go into the esophagus. Does that make sense? So what separates esophagus from larynx is epiglottis. The top part of epiglottis that gets in contact with food is covered with stratified squamous epithelium. Below that, we'll mention, will be ciliated columnar. Okay? It will be ciliated pseudostratified and then just columnar epithelium. So, oropharynx and laryngopharynx, nasopharynx, all pharyngeal parts, they do have tonsils. Remember, follicular immune tissue that provides initial protection against pathogens. Now let's say a few words about larynx. What you're going to find there, importantly. So you're going to find, anatomically, you're going to find voice box. You're going to find vocal folds and vestibular folds. Now I don't have that picture next to me. I will try to explain it using my hands. So basically, larynx is the part of your respiratory system that is responsible for the generation of sound. And I want to highlight it again. It's not speech, it is sound. Speech is your tongue and teeth, right? Sound is your voice box. Now look at my hands. Your vocal folds, positioned like this, when they open, air comes between them, and vocal folds vibrate. This vibration creates sound, just like strings. Does that make sense? So that opening between the vocal folds is called glottis. So the flap of the elastic cartilage that blocks your larynx and does not let food to get into the respiratory system is above glottis, epiglottis. Now, the vocal folds on the sides where my thumbs are, they are bounded by vestibular folds or false vocal folds. Those basically are moving, vocal folds right and left. So, a few things. Why the voice of yours can be raspy when you are sick with some upper respiratory tract infection. Inflammation of the respiratory passages results in the inflammation of the vocal folds and sound, changes. Okay, why we have different voice sounds? Because the length of the vocal folds, the rigidity of vocal folds, and the ability to regulate their tension differs in people. Generally speaking, testosterone makes vocal folds more rigid. This is why men have a lower sounding voice. Does that make sense? So basically the anatomy of the vocal folds themselves is responsible for someone's pitch or timbre of the voice. Higher, lower. Does that make sense to you? The loudness of the voice depends on the force of the air being expelled from your lungs. When you want to, scream, you make a really powerful expiration, basically. Are we clear? So, you know how sometimes people lose voice. It happened to me a couple of times at the end of the semester. Like very last class, and after that I couldn't speak for 2-3 days. Because of overusage, basically, or disease, the vocal folds can be super inflamed and they can't really vibrate. They're really swollen, they're really thick. Okay, good so far? Now, one of the interesting features of the larynx, if you think about it, vocal folds will block the release of air from the lungs. Does that make sense? So there's a maneuver known as Bolsalva's maneuver. When glottis, that opening, is closed actually, the vocal folds are next to each other, and you at the same time try to produce expiration. But you can't, because glottis is closed, right? So what is the purpose of Bolsalva's maneuver? 2 applications. One, to increase the intra-abdominal pressure when, for instance, a person is constipated and they try to push feces out. Okay. Second one, sort of more frequently used, when you lift something really heavy. You inhale and then you close the glottis and you kind of exhaling to brace your trunk. Are you following me on this one? To kind of create this, I don't know how to say it better, to create extra pressure in the trunk, in the abdomen, in the thoracic cavity, to stabilize it when you're lifting something heavy. Does that make sense? So that's Bolsalva's maneuver. Other anatomical parts, so anterior here is thyroid cartilage, Adam's apple. There are plenty of cartilages in the voice box. You have it all on the anatomy study guide. It's not going to be particularly complicated. The point is that after larynx, air that you inhale enters trachea. So here you can see the illustration. So this is your larynx here, okay, the voice box. You can see thyroid cartilage here, you see cricoid cartilage here, and then air enters trachea. So trachea, unlike esophagus, if you remember, it's a tube that collapses. We looked at trachea of a pig. So trachea is always open, and it is open because of this tracheal cartilage. Okay, see that? So the epithelium in the trachea is, again, pseudostratified, columnar, and importantly, it is ciliated. So essentially, cilia inside the trachea beat synchronously, moving mucus up, look, towards the larynx. When mucus enters the larynx, it can be channeled into the esophagus, and you will swallow it, and it will end up in your stomach, and whatever is trapped by this mucus is destroyed. In people who smoke, cilia are damaged, and the mucus motility in the trachea is impaired. Does that make sense? So people who smoke, they have more accumulation of mucus in the trachea, which results in coughing due to the irritation, which results in more frequent respiratory infections as well. Okay? So far, does that make sense? We're good? Now, trachea has structure similar to other hollow organs. So unlike many hollow organs, it lacks one layer. It lacks muscular layer. So it does have mucosa, as we mentioned, pseudostratified columnar epithelium covered with mucus. It has submucosa, we're good so far, and it has outer adventitia. Now what about the muscle? How does trachea contract to expel mucus when you cough? So if you look at the structure of the trachea here, you see that tracheal cartilage, can you see that? It's not circular. The circle is not complete. So the cartilage looks like this. And the ends, these ends of the tracheal cartilage, they are connected by the muscle called trachealis. Am I clear? And this trachealis muscle contracts when your trachea is irritated, expelling mucus. So this is how you cough. So essentially, there is no muscularis layer, but there is a separate muscle. So far we're good? Moving on. So trachea goes on and on down, and branches here into two primary bronchi. Still a conducting zone. So this primary bronchi essentially feed into right and left lung, okay? And each primary bronchus separate into secondary bronchi. Secondary bronchi feed into the lobes of the lung. Okay, does that make sense? It's actually mixed up. It's a left lung, obviously. It is. So they feed into the lobes of the lung, right? Am I clear? And then secondary bronchi here. So here you have, upper and lower secondary bronchus. Each of them is branching into tertiary or segmental bronchi. So far we good? So all this branching happens over and over, as far as I remember, up to 23 times branching. Okay. And it ends up with the terminal bronchiole, the last structure of the conducting zone. So all the way up until now, look, all the way up until now, the single row for all these pipes, check it out, the only row for all these pipes is to conduct the air from the atmosphere down the lungs. Are we clear? And then terminal bronchiole changes into a respiratory bronchiole. Which then feeds into the alveolar duct, which leads to alveolar sac that consists of multiple alveoli. So this purple one is a respiratory zone. So far, does that make sense? Okay, so let's break down some stuff that happens here. So first of all, if you look at the trachea here, trachea does not have muscularis layer at all, right? And look at the cartilage here. Look at the cartilage. Cartilage is pretty hard. It's hyaline cartilage, pretty solid. If you look at bronchi, you notice the same. But turns out, as bronchi, look at this, bronchi start to branch into smaller and smaller and smaller bronchioles, look what happens here. Look what happens along this dashed line. So first of all, diameter. Bronchiolar diameter, what do you think happens to it? They become smaller and smaller, right? Makes sense? Cartilage is replaced by connective tissue. Okay? So far so good? And amount of smooth muscle increases. Which makes sense. In some way, listen, in some way, your respiratory, your bronchial tree, this tree is similar to your blood vessels, okay? Think of it this way. Aorta and large elastic arteries, they do not really constrict, right? Muscular arteries already can constrict, and the smallest arteries, meaning arterioles, very actively constrict and dilate. Am I clear? Now here's the thing. Same happens in the bronchiolar tree. Trachea, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, they do not really constrict or dilate because that would stop the delivery of gas in and out of the lungs. Does that make sense? But smaller ones will regulate the amount of air that reaches the lungs. Are we clear? Now, while we have it here, let's line out main processes that occur in the respiratory system. So the process of bringing air through the conducting zone into the respiratory zone, this process is called pulmonary ventilation. Okay? Now, the gas exchange, and this is something that confuses students all the time. Listen up. This is really like the process of gas exchange between blood and air in the alveoli of the lungs is called external respiration. So, respiratory zone carries out an external respiration. Does that make sense? Good. Oxygen then goes from the air into the blood, and blood transports it to the tissues. So that will be gas transport. And finally, the gas exchange between the blood and the tissues is called internal respiration. Does that make sense? So these four, we can call them respiratory processes. Okay, we're good? Now, a few more details. We never mentioned the epithelium. So epithelium in bronchi shifts from columnar to more cuboidal as we move from bigger bronchi to smaller bronchi, and then epithelium in the alveoli is simple squamous. We clear? Now, real quick to kind of wrap up the functional anatomy. We got the entire conducting zone. Know which parts comprise the conducting zone. We got the entire respiratory zone. Know which parts. Now a few words about lungs. We have two, left and right. The left lung is a little bit smaller because there's heart. Okay. Each lung is divided into lobes. Right lung is divided into 3 lobes. Left lung in 2. Lobes are called superior, middle and inferior for the right, and superior and inferior for the left. Does that make sense? The lobe part. Lobes are further divided into what's called bronchopulmonary segments, smaller chunks of lungs. If my memory serves me well, bronchopulmonary segment is the smallest bit of a lung that can be surgically removed. You see what I'm saying? Like you can remove individual bronchopulmonary segment independently, and the rest of the lung will still function. Questions so far? No? Okay. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk about, we got the anatomy, so next we're going to talk about first process here, pulmonary ventilation.